attempt to refute theism by displaying the continuity of the belief in God with primitive delusion, the method of anthropological intimidation. Edward Bevan, Symbolism and Belief, Chapter 2. I have argued that there is no security against a miracle to be found by the study of nature. She is not the whole of reality, but only a part. For all we know, she might be a small part. If that which is outside her wishes to invade her, she has, as far as we can see, no defenses. Of course, many who disbelieve in miracles would admit all this. Their objection comes from the other side. They think that the supernatural would not invade. They accuse those who say that it has done so of having a childish and unworthy notion of the supernatural. They therefore reject all forms of supernaturalism which assert such interference and invasions, especially the form called Christianity, for in it, miracles, or at least some miracles, are more closely bound up with the fabric of the whole belief than in any other. All the essentials of Hinduism would, I think, remain unimpaired if you subtracted the miraculous. The same is almost true of Mohammedanism. But you cannot do that with Christianity. It is precisely the story of a great miracle. A naturalistic Christianity leaves out all that is specifically Christian. I heard this mentioned, I can't remember yet, yesterday or the day before yesterday, about how a great deal of modern Christianity seems to be attempting to align itself with secularism, that it's attempting to especially to align itself with the popularly labeled woke agenda, and in this it tries to remove the miraculous. It tries to remove the virgin birth. It tries to remove the resurrection. It tries to remove the cross. And I believe it was Douglas Murray, he said, if you remove all of these things from Christianity, what you're left with is nothing, because that is Christianity. Christianity is that virgin birth. It is that resurrection from the dead. It is the cross. It is the Son of God made flesh. It is all of these things that the historian Tom Holland calls the strangeness of Christianity, or the weirdness of Christianity. And if it's gone, what is there? There really isn't anything there. It's what gives it. Even Christ's sayings, even his moral lessons, they are given their punch, or their legitimacy, probably better put, or their validation by the fact that he is and claims to be the Son of God. So removing that, you're left with not much at all. A lot of that secularizing of Christianity is sort of undoing itself, whether it realizes it or not. The difficulties of the unbeliever, Lewis goes on, do not begin with questions about this or that particular miracle. They begin much further back. When a man who has had only the ordinary modern education looks into any authoritative statement of Christian doctrine, he finds himself face to face with what seems to him a wholly savage or primitive picture of the universe. He finds that God is supposed to have had a son, just as if God were a mythological deity named Jupiter or Odin. He finds that this son is supposed to have come down from heaven, just as if God had a place in the sky from which he had sent down his son like a parachutist. He finds that this son then descended into hell, into some land of the dead under the surface of a presumably flat earth, and thence ascended again, as if by a balloon, into his father's sky palace, where he finally sat down in a decorated chair placed a little to his father's right. Everything seems to presuppose a conception of reality which the increase of our knowledge has been steadily refuting for the last 2,000 years, and which no honest man in his senses could return to today. It is this impression which explains the contempt and even disgust felt by many people for the writings of modern Christians. When once a man is convinced that Christianity, in general, implies a local heaven, a flat earth, and a God who can have children, he naturally listens with impatience to our solutions of particular difficulties and our defenses against particular objections. The more ingenious ingenious we are in such solutions and defenses, the more perverse we seem to him. Of course, he says, once the doctrines are there, clever people can invent clever arguments to defend them, just as when once a historian has made a blunder, he can go on inventing more and more elaborate theories to make it appear that it was not a blunder. The real point is that none of these elaborate theories would have been thought of if he had read his documents correctly in the first instance. In the same way, is it not clear that Christian theology would never have come into existence at all if the writers of the New Testament had had the slightest knowledge of what the real universe is actually like? Thus, at any rate, I used to think myself. The very man who taught me to think, a hard, satirical atheist, ex-Presbyterian, who doted on the golden bow and filled his house with the products of the Rationalist Press Association, thought in the same way. And he was a man as honest as the daylight, to whom I here willingly acknowledge an immense debt. His attitude to Christianity was for me the starting point of adult thinking. You may say it is bred in my bones. And yet, since those days, I have come to regard that attitude as a total misunderstanding. I don't know that everyone has to go through this path, this crucible, I guess, that Lewis goes through, or at least that he hints at here with his teacher, the person who he credits with teaching him to think. But that skepticism about Christianity and that skepticism about things in general, at some level probably has to be ingrained in somebody at some point in their education, because especially if you're raised at a Christian home like I was, and not just people who sort of casually believed in Christianity or casually called themselves Christians. There was a lot of the Bible in my home as a kid, and I would say that the sort of essentials of the Bible, and maybe even some of the complexities of it, were already there in my education from very early on. But I don't think that I understood, for however much I do understand it now. I don't think I understood nearly as much then, with being steeped in the Bible, as I did when I had grown up and started to question it. And that questioning came from many sources. But I think we see this too. I don't think you're very close to the truth of the Bible, or very close to God, if we can talk that way, without some sort of skeptical, at some point, some sort of skeptical, questioning spirit. And I think you see that a little bit, and of course I'm hardly the first one to notice this, but you see that in the name Israel itself. Israel means to struggle with God. Here is an entire group of people who God says are his favored people, that he has a special relationship with, and their name, their label, given to them by God, is a word that means to struggle with him, to wrestle with him even. So I think there's something there. I don't know what. I'm not articulate enough to say what, but I think there's something there that we can't really. Maybe it's because even in a relationship, we can't really know somebody if we are completely unquestioning of anything they say. I don't think you probably can't have a robust relationship with any person if everything they say and all of their assertions are accepted by you wholesale, without any questioning at all. So maybe that's just a general principle of relationships that extends to God also. Lewis continues here, remembering as I do from within the attitude of the impatient skeptic, I realize very well how he is force-armed against anything I may say for the rest of this chapter. I know exactly what this man is going to do, he murmurs. He is going to start explaining all these mythological statements away. It is the invariable practice of these Christians. On any matter whereon science has not yet spoken and on which they cannot be checked, they will tell you some preposterous fairy tale. And then, the moment science makes a new advance and shows, as it invariably does, their statements to be untrue, they suddenly turn round and explain that they didn't mean what they said, that they were using a poetic metaphor or constructing an allegory, and that all they really intended was some harmless moral platitude. We are sick of this theological thimble rigging. Now, I have a great deal of sympathy with that sickness, and I freely admit that modernist Christianity has constantly played just the game of which the impatient skeptic accuses it. But I also think that there is a kind of explaining which is not explaining away. In one sense, I am going to do just what the skeptic thinks I am going to do. That is, I am going to distinguish what I regard as the core or real meaning of the doctrines from which, in their expression, which I regard as inessential, and possibly even capable of being changed without damage. Then, what will drop away from the real meaning under my treatment will precisely not be the miraculous. It is the core itself, the core scraped as clean of inessentials as we can scrape it, which remains for me entirely miraculous, supernatural, nay, if you will, primitive and even magical. So Lewis seeks to strip away from Christianity the inessential elements in this chapter. But unlike what he says most modernist explainers do, he is not attempting to strip away the miraculous and be left with simply moral platitudes like we were talking about, where Christ is just a wise man who said nice things, things that you can take or leave, but which if you accept, you'll generally have a better life. He says, when I strip away some things, what I feel we will be left with is precisely the miraculous, even the magical. In order to explain this, he goes on, I must now touch on a subject which has no importance. In order to explain this, I must now touch on a subject which has an importance quite apart from our present purpose, and of which everyone who wishes to think clearly should make himself master as soon as he possibly can. And he ought to begin by reading Mr. Owen Barfield's poetic diction and Mr. Edwin Bevan's symbolism and belief. But for the present argument, it will be enough to leave the deeper problems on one side and proceed in a popular and unambitious manner. When I think about London, I usually see a mental picture of Euston Station. When I think, as I do, that London has several million inhabitants, I do not mean that there are several million images of people contained in my image of Euston Station, nor do I mean that several millions of real people live in the real Euston Station. In fact, though I have the image while I am thinking about London, what I think or say is not about that image, and would be manifest nonsense if it were. It makes sense because it is not about my personal picture, but about the real London, outside my imagination, of which no one can have an adequate mental picture at all. Or again, when we say that the sun is 90-odd million miles away, we understand perfectly clearly what we mean by this number. We can divide and multiply it by other numbers, and we can work out how long it would take to travel that distance at any given speed. But this clear thinking is accompanied by imagining, which is ludicrously false to what we know that the reality must be. I find myself doing that whenever I see diagrams of what the solar system looks like. You see the sun in the middle, massive, and then the planets orbiting around it as these smaller dots. And that's even when it tries to put itself to scale, where you try to have the Earth and Saturn and all of the other planetary bodies to scale in this diagram, even that is ludicrously false for what it actually looks like if you could sort of be outside of it and observe it. There's almost no consonance in it and the actual solar system. And Lewis is trying to make this point about metaphor in this chapter. This chapter is mostly dedicated to how it is impossible for us to step outside of metaphor in our way of speaking. All things ultimately come down to us speaking about metaphor. The books that he mentioned, Symbolism and Belief, and what was the other title here? Poetic Diction. Second one by Barfield and first one by Edwin Bevan. That's one of the main themes of those two books. Those were also friends of Lewis, C.S. Lewis. So the point that he's making there is that when you think of a city, when he thinks of London, he thinks of Euston Station, a train station, but obviously that's not what London is. He knows this even when the image comes up in his mind, he knows that's not London. And when he talks about London to other people, or he references it when he's writing, he knows that he's talking about the real London, but the image in his mind is still Euston Station. To think, then, is one thing, and to imagine is another. What we think or say can be, and usually is, quite different from what we imagine or picture, and what we mean may be true when the mental images that accompany it are entirely false. Just like the London example. He's thinking about Euston Station, which is entirely false for describing London, but when he talks about London, he's describing something true. So his mental image can be misaligned with reality, but still have some value. It is indeed doubtful whether anyone except an extreme visualist who is also a trained artist ever has mental images which are particularly like the things he is thinking about. In these examples, the mental image is not only unlike the reality, but is known to be unlike it, at least after a moment's reflection. You know Euston Station is not London. It doesn't take you long to think that either. Oh, well, of course it's not London, it's a train station, but that's what I think of when I think of London. I know that London is not merely Euston Station. Let us now go on to a slightly different predicament. I once heard a lady tell her young daughter that you would die if you ate too many tablets of aspirin. But why? Asked the child. It isn't poisonous. How do you know it isn't poisonous? Said the mother. Because, said the child, when you crush an aspirin tablet, you don't find horrid red things inside it. Incidentally, that's the name of this chapter, Horrid Red Things. Clearly, when this child thought of poison, she had a mental picture of horrid red things, just as I have a picture of Euston when I think of London. The difference is that whereas I know my image to be very unlike the real London, the child thought that poison was really red. To that extent, she was mistaken. But this does not mean that everything she thought or said about poison was necessarily nonsensical. She knew perfectly well that a poison was something which killed you, or made you ill if you swallowed it, and she knew, to some extent, which of the substances in her mother's house was poisonous. If a visitor to that house had been warned by the child, "Don't drink that, mother says it is poison," he would have been ill-advised to neglect the warning on the ground that this child has a primitive idea of poison as horrid red things which my adult scientific knowledge has long since refuted. So even though the child has this ridiculous image of what poison is, the child still knows poison is dangerous, and you would have been ill-advised not to listen to the child when the child said, "Hey, don't touch that, mom says there's poison in it." So there was wisdom in the child, even though her mental images were out of alignment with what poison is. We can now add to our previous statement that thinking may be sound where the images that accompany it are false, the further statement: thinking may be sound in certain respects, where it is accompanied not only by false images, but by false images mistaken for true ones. So even though, with the Euston Station example, Lewis knows that his image is false, he knows his image of London is completely out of alignment with what the real London is, and yet he can still talk about London and make true statements about it. The child doesn't know her image of the poison is false, and yet she can still make true statements about poison. So both of those things can be true. Your knowledge of the mental image, you can know that your mental image is false, and still make true statements, and you can not know your mental image of something is false and still make true statements about it. There is still a third situation to be dealt with. In our two previous examples, we have been concerned with thought and imagination, but not with language. I had to picture Euston Station, but I did not need to mention it. The child thought that poison was horrid red things, but she could talk about poison without saying so. But very often, when we are talking about something which is not perceptible by the five senses, we use words which, in one of their meanings, refers to things or actions that are. When a man says that he grasps an argument, he is using the verb grasp, which literally means to take something in the hands. he is certainly not thinking that his mind has hands or that an argument can be seized like a gun. To avoid the word grasp, he may change the form of expression and say, I see your point. But he does not mean that a pointed object has appeared in his visual field. He may have a third shot and say, I follow you. But he does not mean that he is walking behind you along a road. Everyone is familiar with this linguistic phenomenon, and the grammarians call it metaphor. But it is a serious mistake to think that metaphor is an optional thing which poets and orators may put into their works as decoration, and plain speakers can do without. The truth is that if we are going to talk at all about things which are not perceived by the senses, we are forced to use language metaphorically. Books on psychology or economics or politics are as continuously metaphorical as books of poetry or devotion. There is no other way of talking, as every philologist is aware. Those who wish can satisfy themselves only by reading the books I have already mentioned and the other books to which those two will lead them on. It is a study for a lifetime, and I must here content myself with the mere statement. All speech about sensibles is and must be metaphorical in the highest degree. We have now three guiding principles before us. 1. That thought is distinct from the imagination which accompanies it. 2. The thought may be in the main sound even when the false images that accompany it are mistaken by the thinker for true ones. And 3. That anyone who talks about things that cannot be seen, touched, or heard, or the like, must inevitably talk as if they could be seen, or touched, or heard. For example, must talk of complexes and repressions, as if desires could really be tied up in bundles or shoved back. Of growth and development, as if institutions could really grow like trees or unfold like flowers. Of energy being released, as if it were an animal let out of a cage. Lewis touches on three fields of study there: psychology, economics, and physics, that have a reputation of being of dealing with real things, of being ultra scientific, of being rigid in their language and their precision. But here they're using words like complexes and repressions in psychology, growth and development in economics, and energy being released in physics, and all of these are metaphorical terms, and must be, even though these are rigidly scientific fields of study. That's not a critique of any of that use of language. I don't think Lewis is saying it's a critique at all. He's saying we don't have any other way to talk. There is no other way to talk. No matter what language you're talking in, if you're going to talk about things that can't be seen or heard, you have to use metaphorical language. Impossible to escape that. Let us now apply this to the savage or primitive articles of the Christian creed. And let us admit at once that many Christians, though by no means all, when they make these assertions, do have in mind just those crude mental pictures which so horrify the skeptic. When they say that Christ came down from heaven, they do have a vague image of something shooting or floating downwards out of the sky. When they say that Christ is the Son of the Father, they may have a picture of two human forms, the one looking rather older than the other. But we now know that the mere presence of these mental pictures does not of itself tell us anything about the reasonableness or absurdity of the thoughts that accompany. Of the thoughts they accompany. If absurd images meant absurd thought, then we should all be thinking nonsense all the time, because probably all of our mental images of anything we talk about are absurdly out of alignment with the way they actually are. If absurd images in the mind meant absurd thought, then we would all be thinking nonsense all the time. And the Christians themselves make it clear that the images are not to be identified with the thing they believed. They may picture the Father as a human form, but they also maintain that he has no body. They may picture him older than the Son, but they also maintain the one did not exist before the other, both having existed from all eternity. I am speaking, of course, about Christian adults. Christianity is not to be judged from the fancies of children any more than medicine from the ideas of the little girl who believed in horrid red things. I the church I went to had these little tracts that they would hand out to people to try to convey some complicated idea about religion, Christianity, to the average passerby. And I think they were called, if I remember right, they were called Tick Tracts, because the company that made them, I think that was the name, or no, Chick Tracts, that's what it was. The company that made them, I guess the last name of the person who started it or whatever was named Chick. And there was probably the most memorable one, the one that sort of hung around for so long, was called "This Was Your Life," and it was a man who, sort of has this good life, he has a nice car, and he's got a beautiful wife, but he also has an affair with somebody else who's even more beautiful, and he drinks casually and feels like he's on top of the world, but he suddenly dies, has a heart attack, and he's in heaven. Or not in heaven, he's standing before God, and he has to listen to God on a giant screen replay his life and show why he was a sinner. And the man invariably is going to stand there and watch all of these things happen and realize that he really wasn't that great of a person. Right? So the track was called "This Is Your Life." Well, the image of God that's in front of him is of this giant figure. Like, God is huge compared to him. He's like an ant in front of him. And he's sitting on a really white, glowing throne, and you can imagine the image. And the outline of God is all there is. The face has no features. It's just blank. But it's the outline of a person, a very large person, with not like fat, but like powerful looking, right? Even muscular, square in almost every way, just like the chair. Really, he was square like the chair. And that image of God stayed with me my entire life. Even today, I have to remind myself that that's fake, that that's not what God looks like, if God even has a look. But I can talk about God, like Lewis is saying, while knowing that image is false, and still make statements about God that are in line with what Christianity says God is. But it's funny how that has, I'm 37 now, and that stuck with me my entire life. Do you have an image like that? Something like that?
I have a few. I think more images. I'd say that depicting what heaven might look like.
Like a city almost?
No.
Because that's what I thought of when I was a kid. It was like a glowing city.
Growing up, it was always images of just huge plains, grassy hills. It's
sort of like a bucolic country setting.
It was more like it was almost like there were fruit trees everywhere, and
if anybody knows you, that wouldn't surprise them at all.
Yeah, there were fruit trees. There was food everywhere. Everyone was either picking or reading from the Bible in heaven. On grassy
picking food.
Picking fruit, yeah. Carrying baskets with bread in it.
So like a land of plenty.
Yeah, there were sheep everywhere. They weren't eating or carrying baskets.
The sheep carry baskets?
No, there were sheep there.
Okay.
I guess they were supposed to symbolize Jesus' presence there. I don't know. Yeah. That's what dominates my brain, those images of what heaven would be like.
Well, I guess we're like the girl with the horse.
The sheep are picky.
Well, I don't know. It's the way you mentioned it. It sounded like
I was just trying to remember while talking at the same time.
Okay, we'll go on back to Lewis. He says, at this stage, I must turn aside to deal with a rather simple-minded illusion. When we point out that what the Christians mean is not to be identified with their mental pictures, some people say, in that case, would it not be better to get rid of the mental pictures and of the language which suggests them altogether? But this is impossible. The people who recommended it have not noticed that when they try to get rid of man-like, or as they are called, anthropomorphic images, they merely succeed in substituting images of some other kind. I don't believe in a personal God, says one, but I do believe in a great spiritual force. What he has not noticed is that the word force has let in all sorts of images about winds and tides and electricity and gravitation. I don't believe in a personal God, says another, but I do believe we are all parts of one great being which moves and works through us all, not noticing that he has merely exchanged the image of a fatherly and royal-looking man for the image of some widely extended gas or fluid. A girl I knew was brought up by higher-thinking parents to regard God as a perfect substance. In later life, she realized that this had actually led her to think of him as something like a vast tapioca pudding. To make matters worse, she disliked tapioca. We may feel ourselves quite safe from this degree of absurdity, but we are mistaken. If a man watches his own mind, I believe he will find that what profess to be specially advanced or philosophic conceptions of God are, in his thinking, always accompanied by vague images which, if inspected, would turn out to be even more absurd than the man-like images aroused by Christian theology. For man, after all, is the highest of the things we meet in sensuous experience. He has at least conquered the globe, honored, though not followed virtue, achieved knowledge, made poetry, music, and art. If God exists at all, it is not unreasonable to suppose that we are less unlike him than anything else we know. There is I'm spacing on who said this, but I believe it was a Greek philosopher who said that man makes God in his image. I think more to the point, he said that if animals could think and if animals could write and speak, they would imagine God looking like them. A wolf or a cow or an elephant, they would imagine God looking like them. But and that's usually stated as a sort of critique of the primitive and imaginary thinking that humans engage in when they talk about God. I had an image of God as a large, square, powerful, man-like figure. Zeus-like is better, yeah, Zeus-like figure, maybe even with a beard, but we are the highest. Like Lewis says, we are the most advanced creatures we're likely to encounter, and it's not unreasonable to assume that we are less unlike God than anything else we know. Now, we're probably really far from what God is, but we're less far from him than probably anything else we encounter. And so, cut us a break when we imagine God looking like us. Cut us a break. What else do we have to go on?
Jesus was man. He was man, so...
Yeah, that's another thing that's sort of encouraging us to think that way. Yeah. Lewis goes on and says, no doubt we are unspeakably different from him, from God. To that extent, all man-like images are false. Those images of shapeless mists and irrational force which, unacknowledged, haunt the mind, when we think we are rising to the conception of impersonal and absolute being, must be very much more so. For images of the one kind or of the other will come. We cannot jump off our own shadow. As far, then, as the adult Christian of modern times is concerned, the absurdity of the images does not imply absurdity in the doctrines. But it may be asked whether the early Christian was in the same position. Perhaps he mistook the images for true ones, and really believed in the sky palace or the decorated chair. As we have seen from the example of the horrid red things, even this would not necessarily invalidate everything that he thought on these subjects. The child in our example might know many truths about poison, and even in some particular cases, truths which a given adult might not know. We can suppose a Galilean peasant who thought that Christ had literally and physically sat down at the right hand of the Father. If such a man had then gone to Alexandria and had a philosophical education, he would have discovered that the Father had no right hand, and did not sit on the throne. Is it conceivable that he would regard this as making any difference to what he had really intended and valued in the doctrine during the days of his naivety? unless we suppose him to have been not only a peasant but a fool, two very different things. Physical details about a suppressed celestial throne room would not have been what he cared about. What mattered must have been the belief that person he had known as a man in Palestine had, as a person, survived death, was now operating as the supreme agent of the supernatural being who governed and maintained the whole field of reality. And that belief would survive substantially unchanged after the falsity of the earlier images had been recognized. Even if it could be shown then that the early Christians accepted their imagery literally, this would not mean that we are justified in relegating their doctrines as a whole to the lumber room. Whether they actually did is another matter. The difficulty here is that we are not writing as philosophers to satisfy speculative curiosity about the nature of God and of the universe. They believed in God. And once a man does that, philosophical definiteness can never be the first necessity. The drowning man does not analyze the rope that is flung at him, nor an impassioned lover consider the chemistry of his mistress's complexion. Hence the sort of question we are now considering is never raised by the New Testament writers. So he compares the New Testament writers who first received the message of Christ as people who were drowning, as people who were desperate for a lifeline, and also someone who was enthralled to his lover's passions. As someone who, like when you first meet someone that you fall in love with, you're not thinking about any details of them, really. You're impassioned by their very presence. The very idea of them is something that awakens verve in you. In the same way, I think Lewis is saying the early Christians were enthralled to the message of Christ, the good news, the evangelia. Those were the those comparisons he draws between a man who's drowning and a man who's just fallen in love with a woman. He's like these are not the kinds of people who are likely to sit down and think about the fine details of the gospel or Christ or who God is or what our images of God are. They were not inclined to do that. So it's not surprising then that you don't find that in the New Testament. Hence the sort of question we are now considering is never raised by the New Testament writers. When once it is raised, Christianity decides quite clearly that the Nath images are false. The sect in the Egyptian desert which thought that God was like a man is condemned. The desert monk who felt he had lost something by its correction is recognized as muddle-headed. All three persons of the Trinity are declared incomprehensible. God is pronounced inexpressible, unthinkable, invisible to all created beings. The second person is not only bodiless, but so unlike man that if self-revelation had been his sole purpose, he would not have chosen to be incarnate in human form. Now at the bottom of the page, he has several footnotes referencing these things. Some of these footnotes are to the creeds that have clarified what Christianity believed over the years, and some are to references to sects of Christianity, what are referred to by doctrinal Christians as heresies that sprang up in the early years of the church. Ideas that Christ was not actually man, he was not physically man, that he was not actually physically God, so those are what those footnotes are referring to here. We do not find similar statements in the New Testament because the issue has not yet been made explicit, but we do find statements which make it certain how that issue will be decided when once it becomes explicit. So those questions about whether Christ was fully God and fully man, those questions had not sprung up yet in the early days of Christianity, which is when the New Testament was being written by the four gospel writers, the letters, the epistles of Paul and Peter and James. These were not issues that they had to deal with yet. Now, when those issues did come up, when various monks or various priests or philosophers made deviations from what the doctrine of the New Testament implied, they were shot down, sometimes violently. And so Lewis is saying that even though those questions were discussed early on, they hadn't come up yet. But the way to handle those questions was there in the New Testament, and once they were come up and people did devote thought to them, most of them settled on a course that we know today as Christian doctrine. The title Son may sound primitive or naive, but already in the New Testament, this Son is identified with a discourse or reason or word which was eternally with God, and yet also was God. This is John chapter 1, Gospel John chapter 1. Even though these questions that we're talking about, these more detailed questions, these more granular questions weren't being discussed in the New Testament, we already find the Son of God, with that title, the Son, identified with discourse or reason or word itself. So already there's a recognition at the very beginning in the Gospel of John. There's a recognition that there's something more here than just Christ as the Son, in the sense of being a descendant of a father. Christ means more than that. He's identified with the Word. The first verse of John is, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Of course, the Greek there is logos. In the beginning was the logos. And this had a lot of, though many people who heard it wouldn't know it because they probably had never read it, this has a lot to do with the discourse of Plato about the logos and how it was the animating spirit of the universe. So already we see a sort of understanding that God, Christ, is not merely some mythological being that has a father and was given birth to, sort of like a mythological Hercules. He's more than that. There's a philosophical, a deeper, a transcendent meaning that the writer of the Gospel of John is trying to understand when he's using the words word, or what we might call reason or discourse. He is the all-pervasive principle of concretion or cohesion whereby the universe holds together. All things, especially life, arose within him, and within him all things will reach their conclusion, the final statement of what they have been trying to express. The footnotes at the bottom of this page all reference scriptures where the statements Lewis is making are supported by. It is, of course, always possible to imagine an earlier stratum of Christianity from which such ideas were absent, just as it is always possible to say that anything you dislike in Shakespeare was put in by an adapter and the original play was free from it. But what have such assumptions to do with serious inquiry? And here the fabrication of them is especially perverse, since even if we go back beyond Christianity to Judaism itself, we shall not find the unambiguous anthropomorphism or man-likeness we are looking for. Neither, I admit, shall we find its denial. We shall find, on the other hand, God pictured as living above in the high and holy place. A quote from the Old Testament. We shall find, on the other, "Do not I fill heaven and earth, saith the Lord?" It's a quote from Jeremiah. We shall find that in Ezekiel's vision God appeared, notice the hesitating words, in the likeness as the appearance of a man. But we shall find also the warning, "Take ye therefore good heed unto yourselves. For ye saw no manner of similitude on the day that the Lord spake unto you in Horrid out of the midst of the fire, lest ye corrupt yourselves and make a graven image." Most baffling of all to a modern literalist, the God who seems to live locally in the sky also made it. The quote here that Lewis is using from Deuteronomy, where God says, and he's using the King James language, so this is a little bit foreign to most people. God says, hey, pay attention. When I showed myself to you, because there was a moment after the children of Israel have left Egypt where um, um, they are complaining about how Moses is the only one who gets to go in and visit God. They always have to communicate through Moses, and they're a little bit upset about this because they have issues of their own that they want to present to God, and also complaints that they want heard, and maybe also jealousy at the fact that Moses is the one who gets to talk to God and they don't. So Moses presents this to God. He says, okay, fine. What I'm going to do is in a couple of days, after you've bathed yourselves, you don't have sex with your wives the entire time. Over these couple of days while you're preparing yourselves, you get yourselves clean, you get yourselves right, you fast this whole time. At the end of that period, I will show myself to you. And so God shows himself, and the children of Israel hear this as a blast of a horn. They don't see an image. They hear a mighty rushing wind, and they hear a blast of a horn. And the sound of it is so great that they beg Moses for it to stop. They don't want any more. They say, you be the intercessor for us between God from now on. That's fine. That was too much for us. We can't take the glory. It was too much. So God reminds them of that in Deuteronomy as they're heading into the land of Israel to claim it. He says, remember, you didn't see any image. Don't go making images of me when you get there to worship and pray to. You didn't see an image. There was no image. And so we see both of these messages even in the Old Testament. So the attempt to sort of look at Christianity and say, well, there was earlier versions of it where these things that you regard as doctrine now weren't part of that Christianity, and Christ was really seen as just a wise man or a prophet, and these images of a man-like God weren't there. But even when we go back into the Old Testament, we find those. We find images of God as being in the high and holy place, up above us. And yet God's saying, I am not a man, I'm not like a man, I don't look like a man, don't make an image of me. So we find both of those elements there. The reason why the modern literalist is puzzled is that he is trying to get out of the old writers something which is not there. Starting from a clear modern distinction between material and immaterial, he tries to find out on which side of that distinction the ancient Hebrew conception fell. He forgets that the distinction itself has been made clear only by later thought. We are often told that primitive man could not conceive pure spirit, but then neither could he conceive mere matter. The throne and a local habitation are attributed to God only at the stage when it is still impossible to regard that throne or palace, even of an earthly king, as merely physical objects. So even when an ancient person thought about a real throne of a king, he didn't think about that throne as merely an object on which the king sat. He thought of that throne as having spiritual value, as having a projection of spiritual worth, of metaphysical worth. That the throne was something more than just a fancy seat, a fancy chair. It was the embodiment of power, of authority, of justice even, because you went to the king for that. You went to the king for justice. The king ruled over between two contrary parties. So the throne was more for the ancient person than just a fancy seat. And in the same way, God's throne was more than for the ancient person than merely a physical object on which God might sit. So this is something you get a real sense of whenever you read the ancients. You see that there's not really a distinction for them between the physical and the spiritual. For us, that seems obvious that there's a distinction between the physical and the spiritual, but for the ancients, that's not really there. Those two are the same thing. They're woven together like a blanket would be. There's no seeing your way. There's no separating the spiritual from the physical. Earthly thrones and palaces, it was the spiritual significance, as we should say, the atmosphere that mattered to the ancient mind. As soon as the contrast of spiritual and material was before their minds, they knew God to be spiritual, and realized that their religion had implied this all along. But at an earlier stage, that contrast was not there. To regard that earlier stage as unspiritual because we find there no clear assertion of unembodied spirit is a real misunderstanding. You might just as well call it spiritual because it contained no clear consciousness of mere matter. Mr. Barfield has shown, as regards the history of language, that words do not start by referring merely to physical objects and then get extended by metaphor to refer to emotions, mental states, and the like. On the contrary, what we now call the literal and metaphorical meanings have both been disengaged by analysis from an ancient unity of meaning which was neither or both. In the same way, it is quite erroneous to think that man started with a material God or heaven and gradually spiritualized them. He could not have started with something material for the material. As we understand it, I'll start that sentence again. He could not have started with something material for the material. As we understand it, comes to be realized only by contrast to the immaterial, and the two sides of the contrast grow at the same speed. He started with something which was neither and both. As long as we are trying to read back into that ancient unity, either the one or the other of the two opposites, which have since been analyzed out of it, we shall misread all early literature and ignore many states of consciousness which we ourselves still from time to time experience. The point is crucial, not only for the present discussion, but for any sound literary criticism or philosophy. The Christian doctrines and even the Jewish doctrines which precede them have always been statements about spiritual reality, not specimens of primitive physical science. Whatever is positive in the conception of the spiritual has always been contained in them. It is only its negative aspect, immateriality, which has had to wait for recognition until abstract thought was fully developed. Material imagery has never been taken literally by anyone who had reached the stage when he could understand what taking it literally meant. And now we come to the difference between explaining and explaining away. It shows itself in two ways. One, some people, when they say that a thing is meant metaphorically, conclude from this that it is hardly meant at all. They rightly think that Christ spoke metaphorically when he told us to carry the cross. They wrongly conclude that carrying the cross means nothing more than leading a respectable life and subscribing moderately to charity. They reasonably think that hellfire is a metaphor, and unwisely conclude that it means nothing more serious than remorse. They say that the story of the fall of Genesis is not literal, and then go on to say, I have heard them myself, that it was really a fall upwards, which is like saying that because my heart is broken contains a metaphor, it therefore means I feel very cheerful. This mode of interpretation I regard frankly as nonsense. For me, the Christian doctrines, which are metaphorical, or which have become metaphorical with the increase of abstract thought, mean something which is just as supernatural and shocking after we have removed the ancient imagery as it was before. They mean that in addition to the physical or psychophysical universe known to the sciences, there exists an uncreated and unconditioned reality which causes the universe to be. That this reality has a positive structure or constitution which is usefully, though doubtless not completely, described in the doctrine of the Trinity. And that this reality, at a definite point in time, entered the universe we know by becoming one of its own creatures, and there produced effects on the historical level which the normal workings of the natural universe do not produce. And that this has brought about a change in our relations to the unconditioned reality. It will be noticed that our colorless entered the universe is not a whit less metaphorical than the more picturesque came down from heaven. We have only substituted a picture of horizontal or unspecified movement for one of vertical movement. And every attempt to improve the ancient language will have the same result. These things not only cannot be asserted, they cannot even be presented for discussion without metaphor. We can make our speech duller, we cannot make it more literal. Number 2. These statements concern two things: the supernatural unconditioned reality and those events on the historical level which its eruption into the natural universe is held to have produced. The first thing is indescribable in literal speech, therefore we rightly interpret all that is said about it metaphorically. But the second thing is in a wholly different position. Events on the historical level are the sort of things we can talk about literally. If they occurred, they were perceived by the senses of men. Legitimate explanation degenerates into muddled or dishonest explaining away as soon as we start applying to these events the metaphorical interpretation which we rightly apply to the statements about God. The assertion that God has a son was never intended to mean that he is a being propagating his kind by sexual intercourse, and so we do not alter Christianity by rendering explicit the fact that sonship is not used of Christ in exactly the same sense in which it is used of men. But the assertion that Jesus turned water into wine was meant perfectly literally, for this refers to something which, if it happened, was well within the reach of our senses and our language. This is a good distinction here. When we make statements about God, and invariably we must be talking metaphorically. But when the Bible says that Christ did something that people, literal humans, could physically sense, like the difference between water and wine, or the difference between a crippled man and one who isn't, or the difference between someone who's alive and someone who's dead, we have to take that literally. Because this was physically sensed and experienced by people, if the stories are true. When I say my heart is broken, you know perfectly well that I don't mean anything you could verify at a post-mortem, so you couldn't cut me open after I've died and find my heart broken. But when I say my bootlace is broken, then, if your own observation shows it to be intact, I am either lying or mistaken. The accounts of the miracles in first century Palestine are either lies or legends or history. And if all, or the most important of them, are lies or legends, then the claim which Christianity has been making for the last 2,000 years is simply false. No doubt it might even so contain noble sentiments and moral truths. So does Greek mythology. So does Norse. But that is quite a different affair. Nothing in this chapter helps us to a decision about the probability or improbability of the Christian claim. We have merely removed a misunderstanding in order to secure for that question a fair hearing.